So before I get started, thanks for coming. Is there anything specific? This one's going to be pretty ad hoc. I want to make sure I answer all your questions. But is there anything specific you guys want to hear about regarding Grunt or Drupal or anything like that? Or just want to kind of see what I have and then you'll just pick it apart later. Okay, cool. Sounds good. All right. So this session called Deploying Drupal with Grunt. Again, this one's going to be pretty ad hoc. I have a few slides, but I figured why not just jump out there without a parachute, do a live demo, hopefully everything works, and then we'll see how it goes. And backup plans to show you an existing project that's running what I'm going to be talking about, and then we can kind of talk about and dive into the code itself, and you guys can ask the questions of what we're doing. So as you know before, my name is Fredric Mitchell. I work at Facey. I'm a senior dev, and this is on the technical side of me continuously striving to do better. So, all right, Grunt. Anyone not know what Grunt is? Awesome. So Grunt is an automation thing, right? So when we talk about automating things, we want to talk about how to make the things we manually have to do every time we start something not have to do that, right? So when you start a new Drupal project, I have to download core, and I have to create a database file, and I have to create a custom module, and I have to do this and set up this server, et cetera, right? Automation is important and good because it basically allows you to do, in terms of name of efficiency, you go from 1x to multiple x, right? When you have to build things yourself manually, it's all dependent upon you specifically, and you in the categoric sense, right? You have to be there to build it. But when you automate it, right, you're taking the things that you know and able to pass it on to someone else, i.e. it's multiple x of the thing that you would do, right? So if you have a specific way of testing something, building something, etc., instead of that process being followed by you physically having to be there in front of your keyboard to build it, if you build it in an automated fashion, you can then pass that on to someone else where they're just typing the one command and it'll engage the assumptions that you have. That's important because then if you decide to improve those assumptions, you can build that into the automation. That's a long story to say that Grunt is that philosophy in JavaScript, okay? So what it allows you to do is automate things using JavaScript. And JavaScript is cool because it's everywhere, right? JavaScript is on the front end. If you've ever heard of Node.js, it's on the back end too, right? JavaScript can be written asynchronously, which means that you can have multiple requests going at the same time. It's not blocking another request. You can fire something off and then have another thing go off and not wait for that thing to respond before the next thing goes. There's a performance thing there, right? And Grunt is not only a process, but it's actually a library too, right, of a whole bunch of different things you can automate with JavaScript. So this is the website for Grunt, gruntjs.com. It's really cool. It really explains like what Grunt is and how to interact with it. As I said, it's a task runner. So you'll hear this term task runner, and all that basically means is that give it a task and it will run it. Give it a task and it will run it. And you define those tasks in JavaScript. Now, the cool thing about Grunt is that the task can be anything, right? You can do stuff like build something, build a WordPress site, build Drupal, and I'll show you the Drupal example here in a second. You can compile things, right? So if you've ever heard of like Sass, right? Anyone not heard of Sass? A little bit? Okay. I know you're raising your hand. I know you've heard of Sass. Sass, as for those who already kind of know it, right, is a language to compile CSS, right? It's a quick way to write CSS. You can have classes, you can have kind of inheritance. It's all this big kind of library. It's basically kind of interesting taking the object-oriented principles of really robust languages and bringing it into the CSS world, right? You have compilation, etc. And that compilation of running Sass compile or Sass compress, right? Or Sass debug, that's a task. And so you can automate that task, right? Every time you change your Sass file, you can have Grunt tell you to rebuild the CSS for you automatically on some server. You can test, right? So whether you're using unit testing like PHP unit or whether you're using like functional testing like Behat, and I'll talk about that a little bit if you guys want to talk about that, of how to actually go through and click the various buttons and make sure the full way of how websites actually are supposed to work actually work and automate that, take screenshots, et cetera, you can automate that task too. You can also lint, and lint for those uninitiated is basically just meaning, so a lot of times when you're building like JavaScript or CSS or whatever, right, you got all these spaces and comments and all this stuff because when you're looking at what you're looking at, you need, like visually as a human being, you need to have big font, spacing, and fine stuff. Well, computers don't need that. And it's actually, you can actually compress that all into a single line or one giant thing, right? Because in the computer sense, something that has a whole bunch of spaces and something that's just one giant line is the same. The only difference is that things with many spaces take up more disk space, right? More bandwidth. So linting basically says, okay, take this thing that I'm working on, and then before it goes to the server for a computer to generate, scrunch it together. Also check for, different awesomeness, whether, should I use this method? Is this method faster? There's a whole bunch of different linting processes you can do inside of CSS and JavaScript, etc. So that's what Grunt is, right? It's this JavaScript ecosystem to create tasks, to build things. Now, when we talk about it in the perspective of, right, what is available, this is similar to how other languages work too, right? Has anyone heard of Composer? Okay, so yeah, as you know, Composer is basically, right, the PHP package ecosystem, right? If someone wrote this package to grab the ESPN API, right, they may put that on Packagist, and then if you want to include that set of code, you install Composer, you reference that library, and then when you do Composer install, it brings that library down, right? Has anyone heard of Puppet? All right, cool. So Puppet is more on the server side, right? When you talk about, okay, I have 10 servers, and I want all the servers to have this version of MySQL, this version of PHP, this version of Nginx, instead of having to go to each server and set up PHP and set up this repo, etc., right? Puppet allows you to automate that. You have a Puppet master, which you can set this set of configuration and then say, okay, all these other ones, right, are secondary. So when I say, okay, Puppet, push this to all the other servers, the configuration is all the same, i.e. it's automated. Puppet has its own kind of ecosystem, right? So this idea that there are packages that you can subscribe to, right, is pretty common, not only in JavaScript, common in PHP, Rails, Python, etc. Python, it's pip. In Rails, it's gem. Ruby is gem, I'm sorry. In Ruby, it's gem. Rails is just a framework. In Ruby, it's gem, right? This idea that when you reuse components, you don't have to always have the component where you're working. You can just reference the component, and then when you actually build the system, you just say, go out and grab it, and then bring it into here. That's actually really important, too, when it comes to, again, bandwidth and version control, right? Because when you have version control and you may have multiple different sites that use different things, it becomes kind of inefficient to check in all the things that are just referencing something somewhere else. This actually makes more sense to not check those things in, right? Because at the end of the day, when you build it on that server, you can just say, go grab it, and then it'll grab it. You can specify the version. You can lock it into what you need that you know what works, and not have to check in all that code so you have the same thing in like 50 places. So if you want to change something or update to a new version, instead of having to go to every site that has your checked in code, you could just automate that, change the new version, and then it just automatically grabs it and pulls it, right? So this ecosystem of packages, Grunt is the JavaScript version of that. So when we add something like a Drupal, right, and Drupal and all of its assumptions, now we start cooking with, with some really cool things. And what I want to show you is an open source library. This is available now, so you guys can actually kind of grab this. Is a library that we just released at phase 2 called Grunt Drupal tasks. And basically what this is a specific Grunt package that will tailor to Drupal based on certain Drupal tasks. So like actually building Drupal and actually testing Drupal and using Coder and stuff like that, right? And it's available for free to use. We want everyone to use it to contribute back, etc. So please definitely, if you get a chance, I'm going to show you what it looks like here. I think it'll be really cool for you guys to see. And like I said, it builds Drupal for you. It does a couple of things if you guys have ever used Coder to make sure that the way that you're writing your code, right, is consistent. There's a set of kind of code principles that Drupal adheres to, spacing, the way you name stuff, etc. This is going to become really big deal in Drupal 8, right, because of the class names and the way you do stuff. And the reason why that's important is because it makes testing a lot easier, right? Again, thinking about you want to go more than one X. You want to have a multiple X philosophy. Is something that I do, can it be duplicated, can it be replicated, and does it require my input for it to be replicated? If I set up a particular set of tasks or if I adhere to a certain standard and others adhere to that standard, right, then my assumptions and the way that I do things can be multiple X kind of moving up. So that's where like Coder and Code Sniffer and Behat, as I said before, kind of fall in. At phase 2, we use Behat again for functional testing. So that's one of those things where when we're building the site and we want to make sure that the image, the page didn't break, that the image is in the right place, that this button is still named the same thing. The cool thing about Behat, though, and I'll get into this if you guys really want to see it, is the way you write your tests is actually very palatable to your user, your audience. You actually write tests in a very kind of plain English language. The language online that it's called is actually called Gherkin, but the way the tests look like, it actually says, when I am on this page, I should see this button, and the link should take me here, and this is what I should see, and I should not see this, etc. It's not tests written in kind of like a code, like unit tests. It's written in this kind of very kind of palatable language. And that's good because when you think about it from a project management perspective, you can actually kind of think, okay, again, going back to this multiple X philosophy, I could probably actually have, right, my content strategist, my client owner, my other project managers, if they can learn this kind of language, they can actually contribute to testing to make sure that every time I'm adding things to this project, it fulfills that particular testing paradigm. And because Grunt can automatically run those tests every single time a developer pushes a commit, you can now get a more consistent output from the project that you're working on, which is really neat. All right, so setting this up is actually pretty straightforward, right? So you install Grunt, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. If you're running, obviously, for those, anyone, so you have is that Windows or Linux machine?
It's Windows.
Okay, cool. You can still install Grunt. We won't judge you.
Because it runs off Node.js, doesn't it?
Correct. Yeah. So you install Grunt. You set up a config file for Grunt, basically just setting up some variables that you can use within your Grunt file.js, right? And then you just run Grunt using this starter package, right? Because we already have a kind of a predefined way to kind of build this, and that's pretty much it. Now, if you think about it again from the automated standpoint, right? Now you can say, okay, well, I could have some sort of continuous integration process that just does this each time, right? I can install Grunt on that test machine. I can just read the config variables and just run Grunt, and I can automate that. And it's within that configuration, within that grunt file.js, that all the assumptions I want to make about my project can be defined so that the only thing that process or that team member has to do is run a simple command, and that's pretty much it. All right, so here we go where we're going to start getting all crazy and stuff. Any questions so far? No? Okay, cool. So I kind of cheat a little bit just to make sure this works. I believe it does. Yeah, it does work. Okay, so I'm actually going to remove this. That's a fun command, right? Remove -rf all. Let me go ahead and close this one. Can you guys see that okay? Let me pull that up to the top. So you can see here I've already kind of run it, and I'll show you this in a second. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from scratch. Right? So you can look in here. I have nothing in here. So if we go to, except my git ignore. If we go to that page where I was talking about from GitHub, right? This is what you're presented with. You basically get this kind of repo of an example, some tasks, etc., and we can kind of dive into this. So again, the most important parts when it comes to running something in Grunt, the first thing is this package.json. If you're going to build a Grunt package that you're going to share with the community, right? You're going to want to define what that package is in that package.json. In Composer, right, you use a composer.json, right, where it's kind of the same thing, where you define what this package is, then you define its dependencies. So you can see here we have quite a few little dependencies. But basically what this does is that it says this particular package is, right, dependent upon Grunt. It's dependent upon all these other libraries that you can see. And the one thing you'll probably see is that a lot of these projects, right, are kind of namespace with Grunt dash name of my project. And we're kind of staying within that paradigm. Here's some of the keywords, and here's the actual repository it points to, right? The other important thing when it comes to having a Grunt package is this grunt file.js. So let's kind of break this down a little bit. So the first thing in a grunt file.js that's important, again, is to basically define what modules you want to actually use in the context of this grunt file itself. Okay, so simply downloading the grunt packages is not enough to just auto-include them. You have to specifically define and export the ones that you want. Okay, in this particular case, we're defining the option of timer, i.e. how long does something take when it builds, right? We also have, okay, go ahead and build or read the configuration, and we don't start one, so when you start a new package, when you start a new project, you don't technically have to, this is where you can define your own variables, and I'll show you an example of what that looks like. And then once you read in those variables, go ahead and set that as part of the configuration variable in this namespace inside of the grunt namespace. And then we actually, just in terms of a code organization standpoint, we actually take all the different tasks that we're doing with Grunt and Drupal and actually pull it into a tasks folder. And I'll show you that folder in a second. That's so we don't have to define every task in the grunt file.js. A lot of times, because of the way JavaScript works, right, it's just kind of one big global namespace. And typically, if you've ever worked with JavaScript, they recommend that you basically define your own namespace and then define your stuff inside there, right? That's why, like, when you're working with jQuery, you have to use, like, the $sign or whatever, because that's what jQuery defines. It's its namespace. Within the Grunt ecosystem and within JavaScript, Grunt is the namespace. So when you're defining variables and defining tasks, right, it's just easier from a code view and a code kind of organization standpoint to kind of break them up into individual JS tasks that you just include, just a basic include. Right? And then, of course, we'll go ahead and assign certain commands, right, that Grunt will run into a variable. Now, these particular commands are interesting because each package that we say is a dependency in our Grunt Drupal task package defines what these commands are, right? So I showed you that big list of dependencies. Validate is a class inside the Grunt namespace that the Grunt validate package defines what that is. If that makes sense, right? So whenever you're trying to validate something, when you define a validate task, the definition of validate and where validate is defined is reusing the Grunt validate package, right? So that may be something like check to see something that's equal to the value that you pass in. So when you define a validate, process, you say what is the source, what is the target, and should they be equal, not equal, the same, sort of the same, etc. Right? It just has that logic kind of built in. The same is true for some of these other ones, right? Symlink, that's just another Grunt task that does symlinking. Like literally when you're in your terminal and you symlink a folder to another place, right? That's what that does. Drush make, everyone know what Drush make is? Who doesn't know what Drush make is? Okay, so Drush is specific to Drupal. Drush stands for Drupal shell. So it's kind of a portmanteau of like those two words, like shortened or whatever. But, and then make is actually Drupal's ecosystem of automating and building things, right? So just like we talked about, Grunt is JavaScript, automate, build stuff. Make is Drupal's automate, build stuff. So when you want to define, like, get this module, get this core, get this theme, a make file is what you would use for it to automatically go out to Drupal.org and grab it for you, right? So similar to how, like, Grunt.js, when I define those packages that I just showed you, it's going out to GitHub, it's going out to Bitbucket, right, to grab those packages for us. Make does the same thing for Drupal.org. Yes?
So are you saying that we could use Grunt to, can we run Drupal make from Grunt?
Yes. Look at that. So we're getting, I'm gonna show you what it looks like. Yeah, that's exactly. We're making the robot build another robot to build the site. Exactly. That's exactly right. So go ahead.
Build a client and launch it for us, right?
Yes, right. And then you build it and it launches, right? So if you think about it seriously, that's actually what we're doing in phase 2. If you think about it, right? So for servers, we got Puppet. For Drupal, we got Make and Drush, right? For putting it all together, we could use Grunt. So now with one command, if you have Grunt tasks that fire Puppet tasks as well, you could, in theory, launch a server, connect the database, do the Nginx stuff, and build Drupal, and do everything, and then you just got it just like that. That's actually what a lot of the hosting providers are doing now, specifically something like Pantheon. Right? I don't know if you guys have used Pantheon hosting or some of the Black Mesh Aquia stuff. They're automating all this stuff. When you go to their website and say, I want a new Drupal site, you click the button, that's what it's doing behind the scenes. Everything is kind of automated. What we're trying to do is share with you from phase 2 the things that we're automating for how we build sites. And you'll see here in a second that the way to structure the site is a little bit different than how you're typically used to when it comes to Drupal. Was there a question? Oh, okay, sorry. So yeah, as I was saying, you can define tasks, and these tasks are more defined in the dependencies inside of Grunt. So like I said, symlink, validate, clean, it just basically is the same thing as what I just did, remove -rf, you can delete stuff. Copy, make directory, you can see that right here. So then we can also have Grunt run composer. So again, the building something to build something else, right? If you want to grab PHP packages, you could have Grunt run that. Compile the theme, bundle install, etc., etc. So as I said, this is inside of gruntfile.js, and the cool thing is that with your project, you can keep adding things. If you find Grunt packages out there and you want to do more stuff, you can just keep adding them to the Grunt file. All right, so as I was saying, everything is kind of broken down into the tasks folder. So you can see here that the reason why you want to organize that is because you can, as a developer, you can jump into this and see, like, what does each one contain, right? You can just tell from the names, like, which one each one is doing. I mean, you could guess, like, bundle.js is probably using, right, the gem bundler to bundle, right, the SAS stuff. The clean is probably the one that takes care of cleaning the appropriate directories, deleting appropriate stuff. Make directory, Drush, copy, etc. So just another way to kind of take all of that Grunt file configuration, instead of putting it in one giant Grunt file, you break it out into individual ones, and it just auto-includes them. So that's what we have here in the tasks folder. All right, so all this other stuff, like I said, this example folder is good because in the README, it actually shows how to start it with an existing project or in a new project. And the example folder kind of gives you a nice little starter package to kind of go with, and we'll actually walk through that here. Then we've got some tests, and that's specifically with the CI that we're using. Has everyone heard of Travis? So Travis is an online CI. Do people know what CI is? Should I explain? Okay. So CI stands for continuous integration, right? Continuous integration. What that means is that let's walk that back, right? Let's say you're using Bitbucket or GitHub to do your code repository, right? How do you get the code to the server that it needs to go to? Like, you're working locally, you commit. How do you get it up there? You push it. You push it to GitHub, but how do you get it onto the server where the website lives? Like
Cruise control.
What's that?
Cruise control.
What's cruise control? Oh, okay. So cruise control is the thing that checks it out and then pushes it to that server. That can technically be considered a CI, a continuous integration. It's continuously integrating your code as you push it to version control. Travis is an online service, a software as a service that does that for you, right? So you define in your travis.yaml file, which is a configuration file, what you want it to do when you want to integrate this particular thing. And in this case, what a lot of packages do is that they use Travis to run tests for them. So in this case, to make sure that we don't break anything as people use, right, Grunt Drupal tasks, is that we test to make sure our tests actually run, which is where it is in that test folder. And before the tests actually run, we need to make sure these things actually are installed on that little instance of Travis that it'll build. So what this does is that as we commit to this repository globally and as people use it, to make sure we don't create any bugs, every time we commit, Travis looks at our thing and says, oh, this package has been updated, let me run my tests. How should my server be set up to run my tests? Oh, I need to run this script, install npm, install these other things, right? Run Drush, and then run my tests here. And then if everything passes, then I get, come on, internet, there we go. Then I get this, build passing, right? So that's how you know, like, the latest version doesn't break the test as we've defined. So it's a continuous integration kind of thing. That's what that file is, just so you know. All right, so if you look at the README of how this actually works, right, we can see that it tells us that this, does some code quality checks if you want to run that, does deployment, Behat testing, all the stuff I just talked about before. So how do we get started? So it says to a new project, what you want to do is in an empty directory run npm install, save, dev, etc. So that's what we're going to do. And what this is basically doing is that it's going to install the packages that are that this particular Grunt Drupal task is running, and put it inside of the folder specific to Grunt. So if one of the things you remember, like when we talk about our build system, right? Composer, Puppet, Grunt, or whatever, right? When you build Composer, where does it put all the stuff? In the vendor folder, right? That's where everything goes. You know, like a lot of times in your version control, you exclude the vendor folder from your git ignore, right? You put that in your git ignore so that it doesn't bring in the vendor folder. For Grunt, it uses the node_modules folder. Okay, so if I run this, assuming that my internet doesn't crap out, what it's doing is that it's running and grabbing all those dependencies, right, and putting them inside of the node modules folder. So if I were to now look in my repository, I get a node modules folder. Okay, so what's step 2? Copy the contents of the node modules folder in the example directory in your project directory, right? Okay, so what I'm going to do then, and I did this earlier, I'm going to not use the terminal because it can take too long. So in an example folder, I'm going to copy this and put this right in here. So I'm going to do this. So now I have all the stuff from the example folder, and I started here, right? So if I look at my Grunt file, right, you can see that all it's pretty much doing is just including, right, the stuff that's inside of the Grunt Drupal task stuff. So all that clean, make directory, drush, etc. I'm basically using that as a dependency. I'm just doing another include to that stuff that's already there, right? Because it's put Grunt Drupal task into my node modules as a dependency. If I want to add more stuff to do, and I'll show you an example of other things you can do, right? You can put it in this grunt file.js. Okay? So now that I have that, all I have to do is run Grunt. And this is going to take a little time because there's a lot of composer stuff. So actually what I should have done, sorry. If you want to see what it's doing, you can do grunt-v, and it will actually tell you what it's doing. So you can see here as composer runs, that's a lot of stuff. So it's saying it's reading the grunt file, grunt config. Then it's initializing. Then it's actually creating, right, the task. And so this phpMD is a code checker. Is making sure that parallel behat is in there and that shell is in there. So grunt shell is actually really cool because, right, you can pretty much do any shell command inside of Grunt. So all the stuff you guys do in terminal, or what's the Windows equivalent of terminal? Putty?
Command.
Yeah, command prompt or whatever. You can do inside of Grunt too, right? That's pretty cool.
Are you running this on Node?
Yes. Yeah, so Grunt, right, Grunt is a node package, I should say. So Grunt, I'm sorry, you're right. So to install Grunt on your machine, you have to install the node package of Grunt, yes. That's what npm install is, when you saw that earlier way up at the beginning. It's making sure that the contrib copy is there. And as it checks all of that stuff, right, it then says, okay, I'm going to do composer install. So what it's doing is that it's checking the composer.json that's inside of Drupal Grunt task and installing the composer modules, right? So it's installing config and CSS selector and mink and all this other stuff. And a lot of this stuff is dependent upon behat, again, the test driver, guzzle, DOM crawler, etc. Then once it's done with that, it's running the validate task to make sure everything is built. Then it tries to PHP lint. It says there's no source file, so it's just going to do everything inside of the source directory. Then it's going to do code sniffer, right? So if it wants to make sure that PHP code sniffer is there, it will run that and make sure that it will look inside of the appropriate extension. It's going to look for PHP files, module files, etc., and then run code sniffer inside of the source directory. And I'll show you why the source directory is important in a second here, right? Then it does drush make, and this is really cool. So make sure that drush make is there. So this is where Drupal and Grunt kind of meet. So when you run Grunt using our package, it actually builds Drupal inside of build/HTML folder. Okay, so it's going to create a build/HTML folder and then put the Drupal root in there, which means that you can exclude that directory from your repository because it's building Drupal each time from the make process, right? And I'll show you again why that's important. So everything when I show you where Drupal is, it's actually inside of build/html. Inside the sites all folder, which you guys are all familiar with Drupal, it's actually symlinking the custom directory for sites all modules custom and sites all themes custom to the source folder, which is at the root of the repository. Okay, and I'll show that again. So that's just, I want to throw that out there, that we're building Drupal in another folder and then symlinking it to the stuff we actually need. And I'll explain why that is in a second.
Now, do we need Drush already on the computer or like under your user, or does this install it?
It doesn't install on your computer. It installs it locally as a dependency from Composer.
Oh.
Yeah.
Local dependency.
Local dependency, correct. Make directory does some stuff. And this is what I was saying regarding the symlink, right? So what it's doing is that, and you can kind of see it here, is that inside of build.html sites all modules custom, it symlinks it to source modules. Okay? Symlinking the themes folder, symlinking the sites folder. Why would we do that? Because at the end of the day, what do you typically change in your Drupal projects? You're changing your sites all modules custom and your themes. Most of the time, when you want to include someone else's module or theme, you're just going to installing it and you're just leaving it in there. You rarely ever touch. You usually can override it, right? If they wrote it correctly, and if they've written it in a way that can be overridable, using Drupal's hook system, etc., most of your customizations are in the custom folder, which means that the only thing you need to track is your custom code. Everything else, you're just referencing all the third-party stuff. Right? So that's why we only symlink that one folder and then build the entire thing inside of build.html. The other reason why is because we make it a point that when we build sites, we don't make the Drupal root, right, where it has sites all, or where sites is and where profiles is and where all the core code is, as the web root, right? So when you're doing like testing, or if you want to add other things, right, inside of your project, you can basically say that the web root can actually point to the Drupal where in build.html, but if you want to do other things, it's not at that web root inside the server, right? You can do other things and just like symlink it back and forth as you need it. And that way, if you need to have things outside of the web root, it can be referenced as more of a symlink or as some other process versus the default is everything inside this folder is at the web root, right? So again, I was saying making the files directory, sites default files, you can see, and then copying folders back and forth, and then it says done without error. So what did that actually do?
So
go ahead.
We can grunt git stuff too, right? Let's say that in one of these particular cases, I've got a third-party module that I had to patch.
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. Yes, you can grunt git stuff. Yes. So it was specific to Drupal and patches. That's actually where make really comes in, or really important, because the question becomes, right, a lot of times you patch something, then you put it in there, and then 6 months later you update the module and you're like, okay, what happened? Like this, some bug that you had back in the day comes back in, right? Where do you put those patches? Where do you put the fact that it was patched, especially if the contrib modules aren't in source control? That's where make actually makes the most sense to build your sites, because you define patches in the make file. And what it does is that it will grab the contrib and then apply the patch on top of it every time it downloads.
I haven't actually done that with make.
Okay, yeah, and I'll show you how that works too. So now if I look inside of this, I went from empty directory to now I have, right, I've got my, where'd my cursor go? Oh, I'm mirrored, that's right. That was over there. Now I have, right, my build folder. I got my node modules folder, as we talked about before, right? That's where all the grunt packages go. I got my vendor folder, right? This is where the composer stuff goes. And then, as I said before, Drupal is in build/html. So if I go to build/html, there's my Drupal root, right? And if I go inside of build/html sites all, right, I get my modules and themes. And then if I go to sites all modules, this is what it did, right? It created a contrib folder for it to put stuff into contrib, and then it created a custom folder that's symlinked back to my source directory. So if we go back again to the top of what this looks like, I have that source directory here, right? Inside of source, I have modules, profiles, my make file, sites, static, themes, right? Anytime I want to customize my site, all I have to put it inside of is in the source module, because when it built, it automatically symlinked to these individual folders, right? And that's really cool because, again, now you don't have to put in version control your contrib stuff, your core stuff, all that other stuff, right? You can just define to go grab it, and then it'll build it for you via Grunt. Again, automating all the things, okay? How are we doing on time? So you said 2:30. Let me go ahead and show you a real-life example before I run out of time so I can answer your question, answer that question. So on a real-life project, because I'm recording this, I'm sure I'll get yelled at later. So we're working on a project. This is what our repository looks like, okay? And this is a Drupal site. Okay, so again, this is our Grunt builder, right? So now you see I don't have a build HTML file in here, right? Because I don't need that. Right? If I look at my git ignore, I'm actually excluding, build, I'm excluding vendor, I'm excluding bin, because all that stuff is built from Grunt. Every time I run Grunt, it rebuilds it each time. I don't need that stuff, right? But all my custom stuff is inside of source, right? So if I look in source modules, here's all my custom modules. That's what I need to track. Every time we change, this is what we need to track, right? Same with themes. My custom themes are in here, right? But when Grunt builds it, it puts it in build/HTML. I point my web server to that path, build/HTML, and then it's gonna show the Drupal site just like it normally would, right? Now the other cool thing is back to your point about make. So when you create a project, in that source folder, you're gonna wanna have your custom make file, right? So here's what we kind of talk about why Grunt is so awesome. So now here in make, all right, this is where you can define all cool different things, right? So in here, I've actually defined what type of Drupal core I want. Instead of getting core from Drupal.org, I'm actually grabbing core from Pantheon, because this client is running on Pantheon. And Pantheon open sourced its version of core for us to use, right? Which is really awesome. Why would I do that? Because Pantheon, for its architecture, has made changes in core to make it run fast on their architecture. So when I'm running things locally, I want to make sure I'm using the exact same code that their eventual system is going to run on, right? So I can pinpoint what core I am here, right here with core. It's coming from Git. I want the master branch, and here it is right here, right? Going back to the patches, look at this. So now I can define modules as I want the CTools module, I want this version, and I want this patch to be applied on top of my CTools module. Why is that awesome? Because now it does it for me. It'll patch it every time the site builds. And you'll never lose track of, was that patched or was that not patched? If we upgrade it, where do you actually upgrade the module? You go into the make file and you just change the version number. That's it. You don't have to do Drush, download, whatever, and all this other stuff. Right? You just change it here, and when you run Grunt, Grunt will build the make file for you. Grab the thing, pull it down, apply the patch, etc., and then your site is built. Yes?
When it runs make and your version changes from like 1.9 to 2, will it remove all the files that were there for that module and then pull down 2, or does it try to merge it together?
It removes them. Yeah. Yeah, that's what so that clean command in Grunt, that's what that does. Yeah. And you can do that with anything, right? We have some other stuff that we have kind of prepackaged. We're calling it Progenitor. We haven't technically released it, but if you ask what that is, that's what that is in here. But you can see like we're mainly pulling out like entity module, views. I want all these different patches because views is crazy. jQuery update with a whole bunch of different packages. The other cool thing is that some of these modules are dependent upon third-party libraries, right? So like when you install Colorbox, for example, you need to download like the Colorbox.js library, right? You can put that in here. Or if you don't want to use make, you can use Bower. And here's the bonus of my presentation. So Bower is a package manager for JavaScript libraries. Okay? So whereas Grunt is a package manager for things that do tasks in JavaScript, Bower is a package manager for JavaScript libraries. So when you want to include jQuery or Colorbox, I'm trying to think of packages that we use a lot. Colorbox, Slick.js for slideshows. What are you using for carousels now? Are you guys still using
We were using the FlexSlider.
FlexSlider?
But now we're using the Bootstrap carousel.
Okay, so if you want to download Bootstrap carousel, whatever. As you guys know, anytime you're like, hey, I want to do this cool, awesome thing. Okay, let's go find a jQuery plugin to figure it out. Bower is the thing that you can just define the plugin and it will go and grab it, download it, and install it for you. Okay? So now Grunt can run Bower tasks. And Bower is awesome because it looks very similar to how you define packages in composer.json and in package.json for Grunt, right? You just define your packages, Modernizer, jQuery migrate, Drupal, etc. Okay? The folder it downloads into is called Bower_components. So really the change in process that you have with all the automation, you just have to know the folder that the thing installs into and then make sure you ignore it, put it in your git ignore, right? So Composer is vendor, Grunt.js is node_modules, Bower is Bower_components, right? And Bower is cool, especially with Drupal, because I don't know if this will actually show here, but it will actually, like I said, go and grab the library, and then you can put comments in the file you wanted to include the library on, and it will automatically put those includes in there, right? So if you think about it from like an HTML perspective, when you include a JavaScript library, what do you have to do? In the head tag, you have to say script source equals this link, etc., right? Bower is awesome because you don't have to do that. When you want to add a new package, all you have to do is put it in the JSON. It will download it, put it on your repository, and then go into your file looking for that comment string and update the list of where the file actually is. So now your package management of JavaScript is automated as well, right? And the cool thing is it's not specific to HTML files and head. You can make that comment in any text type file. So when you think about it from a Drupal theme perspective, when you're including certain libraries, now all you have to do is in your .info file for your theme, put that string and it will write the path to those JavaScript files in there. So what does that actually look like? So if I go back into my source themes, this is what it looks like. I just put this string right here, and I tell Grunt to run Bower on this file, and it will look for that string, and then it automatically includes my stuff in there. Yes?
So do you ever run into an instance where you could install something from a Git repo, either with Bower or Composer, and you just choose one or the other for any reason? Or, because like, wouldn't it technically be possible to download, can't you download with both from a Git repo and say, I either want this one or I want this one?
Correct. So you can get as granular as you need to. If you don't want the Git repo version, let's say you forked it and put it on Bitbucket, you can specifically define where you want to download the source from. If you don't define it, it will do its best guess, and typically right now, Bitbucket and GitHub are the first place it looks. But the other thing that's outside of that is what it's actually doing is that it's actually reading the sites that have a library of all these components, right? So when you use Composer, it's not actually scanning GitHub to look for the package. It's actually going to Packagist, and then when someone creates a new Packagist thing, they say, where's the source of my package, and they typically put GitHub there. So that's what's happening with like Bower and stuff, is that the Bower website has a list of all these packages, the Grunt website has a list of all these packages. So when you define a package, it goes to the Grunt website, looks for that package, the page for that package says the source is here, and then it goes to there and then grabs it. Okay?
And then your entire phase 2 repos is available, not this one obviously, but the example one you were using?
Yeah, that's publicly available, yep. And just to show you what you can do when you customize your own Grunt file, so in this particular project we're using Pattern Lab. Pattern Lab is just a static site generator, just allow you to quickly prototype stuff. We can build Pattern Lab using the shell. As I was saying before, Grunt can run shell commands. Right? I can change into directories, remove files, and do stuff using the shell command. I can run git commands and actually automatically push something and commit to a repo, just like I would do in shell, right? I can make that a task inside of Grunt. right? I can run watch, right? SAS watch. When you compile it and you say like, okay, I changed the SAS file, automatically move it over to CSS. I can run that. I can delete paths. That's where that clean package comes in. I can copy paths. In this case, it's actually copying stuff using the Bower command from jQuery into that theme component I was telling you about before, right? It's copying stuff from our Pattern Lab repository. It's copying things into the Pantheon repository. So in our case, the way Pantheon works, Pantheon, to get the code to Pantheon servers, Pantheon has its own version control, right? So when you start up a Pantheon site, it actually gives you a repo to use, like an actual Git repo. But because we started the project on Bitbucket, we have to then commit to Bitbucket, build it on our test server, make sure it works, and then before to get to Pantheon, we have to copy the files into Pantheon, commit them on the Pantheon repo, then push them up to Pantheon so that they appear on the Pantheon server. But no one has to do that because this is automatically with Grunt, right? What, the commit messages?
No, I was gonna ask you how you actually get the message in as an argument, or?
Yeah, so that's actually what's up here is, so in Grunt, you can pass in arguments. And in this case, the only thing we care about from a Pantheon perspective is the tag that we use to deploy to Pantheon. So like we continue to like develop. Then when it's ready to go to Pantheon, we just tag it. So the only thing we want to see in Pantheon is just the tag that we use. So when we do Grunt, I actually pass the value of the tag into the Grunt command, and then it takes that and actually puts that part of the commit message. So that when you look at it in Pantheon, it says, oh, I'm on this tag. So I can know, at least from our ticket management perspective, we tag all of our tickets with the tag of the code that it's in. So if we want to see like what stuff was fixed in this tag, I can go into, in this case, Jira, click the tag, and then it gives me a filter of all the issues that were fixed on that part.
Time check.
Okay, yeah.
We're going to stay on schedule for this.
Okay. So yeah.
Excellent. Boy, you make me really feel unsophisticated.
It's all good. Thanks for coming.